It is late in the 17th century, and you are walking down the gilded corridors of Versailles. The palace, so often remembered for its glittering mirrors, extravagant fountains, and golden light streaming through endless windows, hides a reality far less flattering. Beneath the polished floors and behind the carved wooden doors, the palace reeked. Versailles was not only a center of political life, it was a place where human bodies, royal and otherwise, sweated, feasted, and relieved themselves with astonishing disregard for cleanliness. And at the center of this fragrant empire stood Louis XIV, the Sun King, a man whose lovers and mistresses endured, and sometimes even celebrated, an intimacy that was far dirtier than the dazzling portraits ever suggest. Louis XIV was, by all accounts, one of the most magnetic monarchs in history. He reigned for 72 years, the longest of any European king, and in that time he became the living embodiment of absolute monarchy. But he was also a man of flesh, prone to smells, sores, and ailments, like all humans. His approach to hygiene, and that of his court, was marked by contradiction. While he commissioned fountains and gardens to symbolize cleanliness, order, and abundance, his own personal bathing habits were minimal at best. Contrary to modern assumptions, the Sun King was not filthy in the sense of complete neglect. In fact, he reportedly bathed, though rarely in water, which was often feared as a conduit for disease. More often, his bath consisted of being wiped down with linen cloths dipped in spirits or aromatic waters. Physicians of the age believed water could open the pores and invite illness into the body. And so Louis's version of cleanliness was based more on ritualized wiping, perfuming, and powdering than actual washing. Yet his body required far more care than appearances suggested. By middle age, the king suffered from chronic dental problems. In 1685, his surgeon extracted most of his teeth in one brutal session, leaving him unable to chew properly and often plagued with foul breath. For a man who surrounded himself with lovers and mistresses, women such as Madame de Montespan and later Madame de Maintenon, his intimacy carried with it a pungent reality. Whispered reports from the court noted not only his halitosis but also the lingering odors of sweat and sickness. The palace itself amplified this condition. Versailles lacked proper plumbing for much of its early existence. Courtiers relieved themselves in corridors, gardens, and behind staircases. Though chamber pots existed, their contents were often emptied out of windows, where they trickled into courtyards or onto unlucky passers-by. The sheer press of bodies, hundreds of nobles crowding daily to observe Louis rise from bed in the morning or dine in the evening, ensured that sweat, perfume, and waste blended into an atmosphere that was as overwhelming as it was intoxicating. Still, Louis XIV cultivated his image as a near-divine figure. His morning lever, or rising ceremony, was a performance in which dozens of courtiers observed him being dressed, powdered, and prepared for the day. Imagine, if you will, the smell of powders and perfumes filling the room, masking but not eliminating the bodily odors beneath. A king in silk and lace, powdered with white dust and doused in ambergris, might appear immaculate, but intimacy with him was another matter. His lovers were forced to reconcile the grandeur of his public face with the unavoidable realities of his private body. It is here that the dirty lovers of royal history come into focus. For Louis XIV, love was political. Mistresses were not chosen only for beauty or affection but for influence. Madame de Montespan, perhaps the most famous, was said to have borne him 7 children. She endured not only his dental decay but also his skin problems, including oozing boils later in life. Intimacy with the king meant enduring the realities of a body that was both royal and human, covered in silks yet riddled with ailments. The culture of masking reality with perfume became essential. France, under Louis, became the center of the European perfume trade. Scents of rose, musk, amber, and jasmine filled the rooms, cloaking the smells of sweat, unwashed clothes, and human waste. The courtiers themselves carried small perfumed satchels to hold near their noses. To kiss the hand of the king, or to share his bed, was to encounter not only power but also the overwhelming clash of odors, some sweet, some foul, all woven into the fabric of daily life. Historians often debate just how dirty Louis XIV truly was. Some argue that he bathed more than most nobles of his age, especially when medical necessity demanded it. Others point to the meticulous records of linens changed, hands washed, and perfumed oils applied. But even so, the royal standard of cleanliness was far removed from modern expectations. Clothes were changed more often than bodies were washed. Teeth were rarely brushed. And intimacy, kisses, embraces, the closeness of lovers, carried with it the unmistakable tang of a human body that lived in a palace where chamber pots overflowed and privies were scarce. The question, then, becomes less about Louis XIV himself and more about the women who surrounded him. What did it mean to love a king whose grandeur concealed such bodily frailty? How did mistresses like Montespan or Maintenon reconcile their devotion with the smells, sores, and decay that lingered beneath the perfumes? And perhaps most curiously, did love in Versailles mean loving the man, or simply enduring the reality of his body for the sake of power? If Section 1 revealed the contradictions of Louis XIV's personal hygiene, Section 2 uncovers something more profound: the way smell itself became political currency at Versailles. The odors of the king and his court were not simply the byproducts of daily life, they were part of the culture, shaping rituals of intimacy, strategies of influence, and even international trade. Perfume was no longer a luxury accessory, it was survival, seduction, and social climbing in one bottle. When you imagine Versailles, the visual splendor comes first: the hall of mirrors, the gardens of André Le Notre, the painted ceilings of Charles Le Brun. Yet to those who lived there, the palace was remembered as much for its atmosphere of scent as for its sight. To step into a chamber was to be hit with layers of perfume, incense, smoke from candles, food smells, and, beneath it all, the persistent undertone of human waste and unwashed bodies. For Louis XIV, this reality required constant management, and the management of odors soon took on political meaning. Louis's mistresses became ambassadors of scent. Madame de Montespan, famous not only for her beauty but for her sharp political instincts, was said to bathe in milk and cover herself in musk and ambergris. This was not just vanity, it was strategy. In a court where proximity to the king meant influence over appointments, land, and wealth, a mistress's ability to make herself irresistible was crucial. Perfume softened the harsher truths of royal intimacy: the bad teeth, the boils, the sweat that no lace shirt could conceal. By masking the king's body and her own, a mistress presented an illusion of purity and luxury, aligning her very presence with the magnificence of Versailles. And this illusion mattered, because courtiers were always watching, always whispering. To smell poorly was to risk ridicule. To smell captivating was to signal refinement, control, and power. Louis's reign coincided with a golden age of French perfumery. In 1656, the Guild of Glove Makers and Perfumers was formally recognized in Paris, giving rise to a profession that would dominate European markets. Perfume was made from flowers grown in Grasse, resins imported from the East, and animal products such as civet and musk. Distillation and tincturing techniques were refined, not only for luxury but also for what people believed was health. Smells were thought to carry disease or protect against it. To carry a scented handkerchief was to guard one's nose against the miasmas believed to cause plague or fever. In this way, the lovers of Louis XIV, and indeed the courtiers surrounding him, participated in a larger medical culture, one in which the masking of odors was linked directly to survival. Imagine walking through the palace at evening, candles burning low, smoke thick in the air, courtiers crowding into chambers to watch the king dine. The blend of smells was staggering: roasted meats, wax, tobacco, powder, sweat, and the occasional whiff of urine from a chamber pot not yet emptied. Now imagine being Madame de Montespan, seated near the king, her body saturated with musk and jasmine, her hair powdered and perfumed. Every move she made was calculated, her scent declaring not only her desirability but her mastery of the palace's sensory world. But if scent was a strategy, it was also a trap. For many of Louis's lovers, maintaining their perfumed identity was exhausting and dangerous. Ambergris, one of the most valued substances of the age, was harvested from the digestive tracts of sperm whales. Musk was scraped from the glands of deer. Civet came from cats bred in captivity. These substances were costly, rare, and sometimes overwhelming. Excessive musk, in particular, could provoke headaches or nausea. Mistresses lived in a delicate balance: too little scent, and the realities of palace odor overwhelmed them; too much, and they risked becoming objects of mockery. Montespan's rivals at court often accused her of reeking of musk, suggesting that her power over the king was artificial, built on overpowering perfume rather than genuine affection. This highlights another truth of Versailles: love was political performance. The intimacy between Louis and his lovers was always under scrutiny, and smell was one of the ways the court judged. Authenticity. Did the king truly desire Montespan, or was he bewitched by her scented presence? Did perfume disguise decay, or did it reveal a lack of natural attraction? It is important to remember that Louis XIV's court was not private. Nearly every act of his life was staged, witnessed, and commented upon. When he dined, nobles watched. When he dressed, nobles observed. Even his lovers were not entirely private companions but figures woven into the grand theater of monarchy. Their perfumes, their scents, and even the rumors about their hygiene became part of this theater. Madame de Maintenon, who replaced Montespan in the king's later years, embodied a different style. More reserved, pious, and discreet, Maintenon relied less on sensual perfume and more on an aura of modesty. Yet even she was not free of the olfactory politics of Versailles. To be near the king, she had to manage her presence carefully, ensuring that her plainness still carried an air of refinement. This contrast between Montespan and Maintenon shows the shifting role of women in the king's life, from perfumed seductress to discreet confidante. Yet both, in their own ways, participated in the masking of odor, whether through the overwhelming use of scent or the careful suppression of it. What happened in Versailles rippled outward across Europe. French perfumes became the envy of courts in England, Spain, and beyond. The very substances that masked the king's dental rot and the courtiers' sweat soon became essential symbols of refinement abroad. To wear French scent was to declare allegiance to the culture of Versailles. Merchants in Grasse expanded their flower farms, cultivating jasmine, roses, and orange blossoms to meet demand. The king's personal needs, and those of his mistresses, reshaped entire industries. In this sense, the intimate relationships of Versailles contributed to the growth of global trade, connecting the sweat-soaked chambers of the palace to the fields of Provence and the markets of the Mediterranean. And yet, for all the perfume, the powders, and the careful rituals of masking, the truth of Louis XIV's body could not be fully concealed. He continued to suffer from bad breath, skin conditions, and eventually gangrene, which ravaged his final years. His lovers endured the contradictions of power and intimacy. They were close enough to touch a man worshipped as divine, but close enough also to smell the decay beneath the gold. The palace itself remained a paradox, a symbol of order that was, in reality, overwhelmed with filth. And so the question lingers: did the perfumes of Versailles truly make love and intimacy bearable, or did they merely remind everyone that even the most powerful king in Europe could never fully escape the stench of his humanity? If Versailles was a stage, then the women who shared the Sun King's bed were its leading performers. Each mistress had her own role in the drama of Louis XIV's reign, and each endured the contradictions of loving a man who was both a godlike ruler and a deeply human body. Their intimacy was never only about passion, it was about influence, survival, and the daily negotiation of power in a palace that glittered on the surface and reeked beneath. Among Louis XIV's lovers, none was more infamous than Madame de Montespan. Born Françoise Athénaise de Roquecourt de Mortemart, she came to Versailles in the 1660s as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. With her wit, charm, and striking presence, she quickly captured the king's attention. But intimacy with Louis was not simple. Montespan bore him 7 children, a testament to her long-standing role in his private life. Yet to remain desirable in the stifling atmosphere of Versailles, she relied heavily on perfumes and cosmetics. Reports from contemporaries describe her as enveloped in musk and ambergris, her hair powdered, her dresses richly scented. She was, in a sense, a living perfume bottle, carrying with her both allure and controversy. Rivals at court mocked her reliance on heavy scents, suggesting that she hid not only her body's natural odors but also the corruption of her ambitions. Whispered accusations of witchcraft and the notorious affair of the poisons further tainted her reputation. Montespan, some said, used love potions and aphrodisiacs to maintain her hold over the king. Whether true or not, the rumors reveal how closely the body, its smells, and its secrets were tied to power. As Montespan's influence waned, another woman stepped into the king's private world, Madame de Maintenon. Where Montespan was fiery and perfumed, Maintenon was discreet, modest, and pious. She became governess to the king's illegitimate children and gradually moved into his affections. Unlike Montespan, Maintenon did not dazzle with scent or spectacle. Instead, she offered Louis something he increasingly craved in his later years: calm. By the 1680s, the king was aging, plagued by illnesses, and wearied by the endless performance of court life. Maintenon provided him with a form of intimate companionship that was less about seduction and more about consolation. Still, even Maintenon had to navigate the olfactory world of Versailles. Though she shunned overpowering perfumes, she embraced subtler scents and the ritual of cleanliness through linen changes and dry washing. In this way, she maintained her aura of quiet refinement, proving that even piety required a kind of sensory performance in the palace. Amidst these powerful mistresses stood Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, Louis XIV's wife. Though she bore him airs and performed her ceremonial role, she was never the center of his affections. She lived quietly in the shadow of Montespan and Maintenon, enduring a marriage in which her husband's lovers wielded more influence than she ever could. For Maria Theresa, the reality of Versailles was even harsher. She suffered frequent illness and, like many royals, carried the genetic legacy of the Habsburg dynasty, including physical fragility. Her presence at Versailles was perfumed and adorned, but her daily existence was shaped by loneliness and the knowledge that intimacy with her husband was perfunctory at best. The queen's body was a vessel for heirs, her role diminished by the king's endless appetite for mistresses. To love Louis XIV was to endure more than bad breath and the filth of Versailles. It was to be entangled in the politics of scent, the scrutiny of courtiers, and the shifting tides of power. Mistresses were never private figures, their bodies and their intimacy with the king were matters of public interest. Consider, for example, the daily rituals of the palace. When Montespan appeared at the king's side, nobles noted her perfume and her expression, interpreting every detail as a signal of favor. When Maintenon spoke with the king, her plainness was interpreted as a moral corrective to Montespan's excesses. Even the queen's silence was read as political weakness. Every gesture, every odor, every rumor carried weight. By the time Louis XIV grew old, Versailles had become the most famous palace in Europe, a symbol of power, culture, and refinement. Yet the mistresses who defined his reign remind us that beneath the grandeur lay a world of human frailty. The Sun King may have been worshipped as a semi-divine figure, but those who shared his bed knew the truth: he was a man whose body aged, ached, and smelled like any other. And so, the story of Louis XIV's dirty love is not one of scandal alone. It is a story of resilience, of women who navigated the stench and splendor of Versailles, who transformed intimacy into influence, and who bore the contradictions of loving a king who was both magnificent and profoundly human. Today, when tourists walk through the Hall of Mirrors or stroll in the gardens of Versailles, they see only the glittering shell of Louis XIV's world. They do not smell the perfumes, the sweat, the waste, or the bad breath that once defined the palace atmosphere. They do not hear the whispered rumors of poison, or the sighs of mistresses exhausted by the performance of intimacy. But if you close your eyes, you can imagine it: the musk of Montespan, the quiet presence of Maintenon, the weary silence of Maria Theresa, and the Sun King himself, radiant in gold yet reeking of decay. And you may wonder, in the end, did love at Versailles ever truly exist, or was it always a performance, staged in a palace that sparkled like the sun but smelled like the earth beneath? The 16th century was an age of fragrance, fear, and fragile dynasties. In France, where royal marriages stitched together uneasy alliances, few figures embodied the paradox of beauty and danger more than Catherine de' Medici, queen consort to Henry II and later regent for her sons. She is often remembered as a schemer, accused of dabbling in poison and witchcraft, yet she was also a patron of the arts, fashion, and one of the earliest champions of perfumery at the French court. Her world was one where perfumes were never simply pleasant; they were tools of medicine, symbols of refinement, and, in darker whispers, instruments of murder. Catherine was born in 1519 into the powerful Medici family of Florence. When she married Henry, Duke of Orleans, later King Henry II of France, in 1533, she brought with her not only her dowry but also an entourage of Florentine artisans, including Renato Bianco, a perfumer who would later become known in France as René Le Florentin. This single act, importing her personal perfumer, reshaped French courtly life for generations. At that time, perfume was not considered frivolous. Physicians believed that disease traveled through foul air, the so-called miasma. To smell sweet was to protect oneself from plague, fever, and corruption. Catherine's perfumes, distilled from herbs, flowers, and exotic resins, were thought to act as invisible shields, warding off sickness. To wear perfume was to announce not only elegance but also survival. Imagine the French court in the mid-1500s, crowded halls, flickering torches, the sweat of courtiers packed shoulder to shoulder, the faint stench of chamber pots, and the smoke of incense intended to cover it all. Into this world Catherine introduced refined perfumes from Florence: citrus oils, rosemary, bergamot, ambergris, and jasmine. She carried scented gloves, sachets of herbs, and pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic substances. These were not simply ornaments. In an age when epidemics frequently swept through cities, to breathe perfume was to breathe safety. Catherine was often seen holding her pomander close to her face, as if guarding herself against invisible threats. Courtiers soon followed her example, and within a generation, France had become the new capital of perfumery, but Catherine's perfumes carried darker associations as well. The same perfumer, René Le Florentin, was rumored to have knowledge of toxicology. Whisperers claimed that perfumes and scented gloves could be laced with poison. Enemies accused Catherine of orchestrating assassinations by scent, of slipping venom into the very air her rivals breathed. The most notorious tale concerned Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, who died in 1572 shortly before the marriage of her son, Henry of Navarre, to Catherine's daughter, Marguerite de Valois. Rumors claimed that Jeanne was killed by a pair of poison gloves, perfumed in such a way that the scent itself carried death. Historians now largely dismissed the story, pointing instead to natural illness, but the myth endured, feeding Catherine's reputation as the Italian queen who brought dark arts to France. Whether true or not, the accusations reveal how closely scent, intimacy, and danger were linked in Renaissance courts. To inhale a fragrance was to risk enchantment. To accept a gift of perfumed gloves was to gamble with one's life. Catherine's own marriage was a study in contradiction. Though she adored Henry II, he was famously devoted to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine endured years of humiliation, watching her rival dominate both the king's heart and political influence. Yet even in this triangle, scent played its role. Diane was said to favor subtle, clean fragrances that emphasized her elegance and self-control, while Catherine's Florentine perfumes were richer, spicier, and more exotic. The difference in scent became a metaphor for their rivalry, the mistress embodying restraint, the queen embodying foreign mystery. Behind these personal struggles lay the larger weight of politics. Catherine was not just a wife or a mother, she became regent for 3 of her sons after Henry's death. France, fractured by wars of religion, teetered constantly on the edge of collapse. Perfume, for her, was a small but significant tool of control, a way to craft her image, to protect her health, and perhaps, if rumors are to be believed, to eliminate her enemies. What is most remarkable is how enduring Catherine's influence proved to be. By the late 16th century, perfumed gloves were essential accessories for courtiers across Europe. The perfumers of Grasse, who would later dominate the world's fragrance trade, owed much of their rise to the demand she sparked. Perfume became woven into the very fabric of French culture, no longer an Italian curiosity but a French necessity. And yet, the shadow of poison always lingered. Every sweet scent carried with it the possibility of death. Every lover, every rival, every courtly gift raised suspicion. So we are left with a tantalizing thought: did Catherine de Medici truly use perfumes as weapons, or was her reputation the invention of enemies who feared her power? Were her fragrant gloves symbols of refinement, or the instruments of murder? And perhaps more hauntingly, in a world where smell meant survival, could love itself ever be separated from the fear of poison? When we speak of royal courts, we often imagine glittering ceremonies, jeweled gowns, and stately processions. But for Catherine de Medici and her children, the Valois court was also an arena of whispers, betrayals, and private passions, where fragrance, intimacy, and fear were tangled together. Catherine's perfumes were more than ornaments, they were markers of presence, tools of persuasion, and reminders that the most personal details of life could shape the course of politics. Catherine lived in an age when France was torn by religious conflict. The wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants scarred the kingdom with violence, distrust, and bloodshed. Within this fractured realm, the Valois monarchy struggled to assert control. Catherine, as mother to 3 kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, became the central figure holding the dynasty together. But holding a court together required more than speeches or decrees. It meant creating a daily atmosphere of awe, comfort, and sometimes fear. And in this, the senses mattered. When courtiers entered Catherine's chambers, they did not only see her power, they inhaled it. Perfumes hung in the air, clinging to her gloves, her hair, her dresses. To encounter her was to be enveloped in an aura carefully crafted to inspire reverence and suspicion in equal measure. In the Renaissance, intimacy was never purely private. Lovers, rivals, and political allies all operated in the same crowded spaces. Catherine, though a widow after Henry II's death in 1559, understood the importance of controlling the court's intimate atmosphere. Her sons and daughters-in-law brought their own rivalries and romances into the palace. Marguerite de Valois, known to history as Queen Margot, was famed for her beauty, charm, and scandalous affairs. She too relied on perfumes to maintain her allure. Descriptions of her at court often note the exotic fragrances she wore, layering jasmine, amber, and musk in ways that announced her presence long before she entered a room. For Marguerite, as for her mother, scent was an extension of desire, a way of shaping how others perceived her body. In this sense, the Valois women became pioneers of a sensory politics that blended love and power. To be perfumed was to be noticed, to be remembered, to be impossible to ignore. The constant rumors of poisoned perfumes reveal how fragile intimacy was at the Valois court. The very objects of love, gloves, handkerchiefs, cosmetics, were feared as weapons. Enemies whispered that a lover's kiss might conceal poison, that a queen's perfumed gift might carry death. Such stories often surrounded Catherine herself, who was accused of eliminating rivals through invisible means. Even if untrue, these rumors shaped how people interacted with her. A gift of perfumed gloves from the queen could inspire both delight and dread. To wear them was to bask in her favor, to refuse them was to risk insult. In this way, love and fear coexisted, with perfume acting as the invisible thread that tied them together. Catherine was fascinated by astrology, alchemy, and medicine. She surrounded herself with Italian astrologers and French physicians, blending science and superstition in her daily life. Perfume, for her, was not merely a cosmetic indulgence but a branch of medicine. Recipes for her scents often included herbs thought to ward off plague: rosemary, thyme, clove, and camphor. Some were prepared in elaborate distillations, combining flowers with alcohol and resins. These mixtures were applied not only to the skin but also to rooms, clothing, and even writing paper. Imagine receiving a letter from Catherine de' Medici, the parchment faintly scented with bergamot and amber. The smell would linger long after the words had been read, a reminder of her presence, a subtle claim on the senses of the recipient. But these same physicians and alchemists were also rumored to experiment with toxins. The line between medicine and poison was thin. A dose that healed in one measure could kill in another. This ambiguity gave Catherine's perfumes their dark reputation. Behind the political maneuvering were the personal relationships that gave the court its emotional texture. Catherine's sons were notoriously dependent on their favorites, close companions whose intimacy with the king often caused scandal. Charles IX was haunted by guilt and paranoia, while Henry III surrounded himself with flamboyant favorites known as the Mignons. For these men, perfume and display were also tools of identity. The Mignons were mocked by enemies for their scented hair, jeweled clothing, and carefully maintained appearance. Yet this attention to fragrance and style was more than vanity. It was a declaration of loyalty to the king, a way of transforming intimacy into political symbolism. Catherine, always watchful, understood how fragile such bonds were. She knew that the scents of her court, the perfumes on her daughters, the musk on her sons' companions, the smoke of incense in her chambers, were not merely pleasant details but signs of shifting alliances. Step into the Louvre Palace in the 1570s, when Catherine held sway as regent. The air is heavy, not only with candle smoke and food but with competing perfumes. Each noble carries their identity in scent, lavender for one, musk for another, citrus for another still. The Queen Mother's chambers are thick with Florentine blends, sharp and exotic, marking her as different from the French-born nobles around her. In this atmosphere, love could never be simple. A whispered declaration carried the undertone of politics. A perfumed gift carried the shadow of poison. Intimacy was always entangled with fear, and scent was the invisible stage upon which these dramas played out. And so, Catherine's legacy in this period is not just that of a queen or a regent, but of a woman who turned the hidden intimacies of the court into a theater of fragrance. She transformed smell into a language of power, where love could signal loyalty but also invite suspicion. The question remains, in a world where every scent was both alluring and dangerous, could anyone at the Valois court ever truly love freely, without wondering if the air itself carried betrayal? History remembers Catherine de Medici in contradictory ways, as a grieving widow, a cunning regent, a protective mother, and a ruthless schemer. Yet one thread binds these images together, the atmosphere she created around herself. Perfume, more than politics, has become the emblem of her legacy. To understand how her memory endured, we must look at how scent became entangled with scandal, survival, and myth. Catherine's most infamous association is with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris. Though historians still debate her role, her reputation was forever marked. In the aftermath, rumors spread that she had orchestrated the killings not only through orders but through invisible means, poisons, potions, and perfumes. Enemies described her as a black widow weaving webs of fragrance that suffocated her rivals. The association of her name with perfumed murder took hold, cementing her as a dark figure in European imagination. What is striking, however, is that her supposed weapon was not the sword or the musket but the scented glove, the perfumed handkerchief, the vial of distilled herbs. The myths surrounding Catherine reveal how powerfully people believed in the political potency of fragrance. That we must remember, too, that Renaissance France was not perfumed luxury as we imagine it today. The streets of Paris stank of refuse, the palaces reeked of smoke, sweat, and poorly drained latrines. To wear perfume was not merely an indulgence, it was a necessity for survival in an age when disease was believed to travel through foul air. Catherine and her court masked not only their bodies but their surroundings. Banquets were prepared with rosewater, halls washed with vinegar and herbs, and wardrobes stuffed with sachets of lavender. Even political gatherings unfolded within this carefully managed cloud of scent. In this sense, Catherine's reliance on fragrance was not sinister but practical. It created an environment in which diplomacy could occur, where courtiers could endure each other's company despite the stench of an unwashed world. But practicality often appears threatening when wielded by a powerful woman. What for a man might have been seen as wisdom was, in Catherine's case, reimagined as witchcraft. Despite her efforts, Catherine could not secure the Valois line. Her 3 sons all became kings, but none produced legitimate heirs who survived. By the end of the century, the dynasty had collapsed, replaced by the Bourbon line under Henry IV. Yet even as the Valois crown faded, the association between perfume and power endured. Henry IV's court, and later Louis XIV's at Versailles, inherited Catherine's fascination with scent. The French perfume industry blossomed, and perfumers gained prestige as artisans who could serve kings and queens alike. In this way, Catherine's legacy is paradoxical. Though her political dynasty failed, her sensory dynasty, the culture of French fragrance, thrived. Over time, Catherine de Medici became less a person than a legend. Playwrights, pamphleteers, and novelists painted her as a serpent queen, a woman whose very breath might carry poison. In these depictions, perfume symbolized her hidden nature, sweet to the nose, deadly to the body. But in a gentler light, we can also see her as a woman who endured unimaginable pressures, widowed young, forced to safeguard her children's throne, trapped in wars of religion that tore her country apart. For Catherine, perfume was not only a weapon of power but also a shield against grief, fear, and decay. It was her way of controlling the uncontrollable, of shaping the air when politics and fate slipped through her fingers. When Catherine died in 1589, she left behind not only a fractured kingdom but a sensory legacy. The very air of her chambers, laced with bergamot, musk, and rosewater, seemed to cling to her memory. To some, it was the scent of conspiracy, to others, the perfume of resilience. Her story reminds us that history is not only written in battles and treaties but also in the intimate, invisible details of daily life. A fragrance can haunt a room long after its wearer has departed, and in Catherine's case, her perfumes still seem to linger in the imagination of Europe. Even now, centuries later, we cannot ask about Catherine de' Medici without asking, did her perfumes heal or harm, seduce or destroy? Or were they simply the fragile attempt of a queen to sweeten the air of a troubled world? When you picture Henry VIII of England, you probably imagine the towering figure in Holbein's portrait, broad shoulders, ornate garments, a commanding presence that fills the room. Yet what is less often remembered is the sensory reality of his reign. Henry lived in a world where personal hygiene was uncertain, perfumes were few, and desire was entangled with sweat, feasts, and the raw odor of human life. To begin understanding Henry's relationships, and why he earned such a reputation as one of history's dirtiest lovers, we need to step inside his court, not just through its politics, but through its smells, textures, and routines. The Tudor court was designed to overwhelm. Guests were dazzled with gold embroidery, heavy tapestries, and the endless echo of music and banquets. But underneath this magnificence lay another truth: the court was crowded, hot, and often unwashed. Henry's palaces were filled with courtiers, servants, cooks, guards, and petitioners. The air inside the great halls was thick with the smell of roasted meats, spiced pies, spilled ale, and human sweat. Ventilation was poor, laundry was irregular, and bathing was limited. Yet this very environment was the stage for Henry's romances, with 6 wives, numerous mistresses, and endless flirtations. Love at the Tudor court was not scented with roses but with the musk of bodies pressed too close together in overheated chambers. Despite his power, Henry VIII's hygiene was far from modern standards. He bathed occasionally in perfumed water, but not daily. His laundresses prepared clean shirts for him each day, believing that linen worn against the skin could draw out impurities. Instead of soap, he often relied on fresh undergarments to keep himself presentable. Yet Henry's body betrayed him. By middle age, he was plagued by ulcers on his legs that oozed constantly, filling the court with a sickly odor. Servants had to dress and bandage him, and yet he continued to surround himself with admirers. Desire persisted even as his body became a site of pain, infection, and decay. Food was central to Henry's passions. Banquets could last for hours, with tables groaning under the weight of venison, swan, and whole roasted boars. These meals were not just about nourishment but about seduction. Courtiers flirted between courses, exchanged glances over goblets of wine, and tested alliances through shared dishes. It was in these spaces that Henry's eye often wandered, from Catherine of Aragon to Anne Boleyn, from Jane Seymour to Catherine Howard. Love affairs began in the glow of candlelight, the air hazy with the smell of roasted flesh and spiced sauces. But romance forged in such settings was fragile, dependent on appetite and performance. The same feasts that stirred desire also fueled suspicion, jealousy, and betrayal. Henry VIII embodied a contradiction, a man of immense charm and attraction in his youth, whose presence later became shadowed by disease and foul odors. Yet his longing for love, heirs, and devotion never waned. His lovers endured not only the risks of politics but also the physical discomfort of proximity to a king whose body was far from pleasant. This raises an unsettling question: when Anne Boleyn whispered to Henry, when Jane Seymour comforted him, when Catherine Howard dared to flirt, what did they smell, what did they endure? Love at the Tudor court was as much about tolerance of the senses as it was about political ambition. That if Henry VIII's court was a theatre of odors, then Anne Boleyn entered the stage as a figure of contrast. Where Henry's presence was increasingly marked by sweat, sores, and heaviness, and carried with her an aura of freshness, wit, and calculated fragrance. To understand their fateful union, we must look at how attraction was shaped not only by politics and ambition but by the intimate reality of scent, touch, and daily life. Anne Boleyn was not considered a conventional beauty by her peers. She was slender, dark hair. And sharp-eyed, striking, yes, but not the golden-haired ideal of Tudor femininity. Yet she understood the power of presentation. And is said to have worn subtle perfumes imported from France, where she had served at the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude. Unlike the heavy, musky scents favored by some courtiers, and preferred lighter floral notes, perhaps lavender or citrus, that cut through the stuffiness of Tudor halls. In a world where people often carried the odor of unwashed clothes, muddy streets, and smoky fires, such freshness was magnetic. To Henry, and was not simply different, she smelled different, Henry pursued and with relentless passion. He wrote her letters describing his longing, even sending gifts of jewels and tokens perfumed with musk. Yet his advances were complicated by the very realities of his body. By this time, Henry was prone to heavy perspiration and carried the sour smell of a man who overindulged in food and rarely exercised. His festering leg ulcer required constant dressing, and though attendants washed and perfumed him, the odor was difficult to disguise. Imagine an at court, seated beside the king during a banquet, the scent of roasted meats mixing with the faint smell of wine on his breath, his perfumed gloves attempting to mask the odor beneath. Desire in this setting was not the sweet image we might imagine, but something earthy, raw, and unavoidable, and used fragrance not only for seduction but for political theater. Small pomanders filled with cloves, ambergris, or dried flowers were worn as jewelry, doubling as both protection against disease and a sensory signal of refinement. When and carried such objects, she projected an image of sophistication and modernity, a woman set apart from the damp, crowded world around her. Henry, captivated, elevated her above all others. Yet in doing so, he set into motion the unraveling of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The perfume of Anne's presence clung. And sharp-eyed, striking, yes, but not the golden-haired ideal of Tudor femininity. Yet she understood the power of presentation. And is said to have worn subtle perfumes imported from France, where she had served at the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude. Unlike the heavy, musky scents favored by some courtiers, and preferred lighter floral notes, perhaps lavender or citrus, that cut through the stuffiness of Tudor halls. In a world where people often carried the odor of unwashed clothes, muddy streets, and smoky fires, such freshness was magnetic. To Henry, and was not simply different, she smelled different, Henry pursued and with relentless passion. He wrote her letters describing his longing, even sending gifts of jewels and tokens perfumed with musk. Yet his advances were complicated by the very realities of his body. By this time, Henry was prone to heavy perspiration and carried the sour smell of a man who overindulged in food and rarely exercised. His festering leg ulcer required constant dressing, and though attendants washed and perfumed him, the odor was difficult to disguise. Imagine an at court, seated beside the king during a banquet, the scent of roasted meats mixing with the faint smell of wine on his breath, his perfumed gloves attempting to mask the odor beneath. Desire in this setting was not the sweet image we might imagine, but something earthy, raw, and unavoidable, and used fragrance not only for seduction but for political theater. Small pomanders filled with cloves, ambergris, or dried flowers were worn as jewelry, doubling as both protection against disease and a sensory signal of refinement. When and carried such objects, she projected an image of sophistication and modernity, a woman set apart from the damp, crowded world around her. Henry, captivated, elevated her above all others. Yet in doing so, he set into motion the unraveling of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The perfume of Anne's presence clung to him, even in the Queen's chambers. For Catherine, this was not simply an emotional betrayal but a sensory one. She could almost smell the intrusion of another woman. The king's obsession with Anne sparked the English Reformation, a break with Rome that reshaped Europe. But beneath the grand narrative lies a simple, uncomfortable truth. this historic rupture was fueled by a deeply human attraction, born in the midst of sweat, perfumes, and the sensory life of the Tudor court. When Henry secretly wed and then crowned her queen, the court celebrated with pageantry. But the air of the coronation was not filled with roses alone, it was also filled with suspicion, tension, and the stifling heat of crowded halls. The same air that carried Anne's carefully chosen perfume also carried whispers of doubt and resentment. Anne's time as queen was brief and perilous. Once desired beyond reason, she soon found herself judged harshly for her inability to produce a male heir. Henry's passion, once inflamed, cooled into resentment. And here, the smells of the court turned once again. The feasts that once symbolized joy became heavy with unease. The scent of Anne's perfumes, once irresistible, became a reminder of unfulfilled promises. By the time of her arrest and execution in 1536, the court no longer described her with admiration but with suspicion, her allure reimagined as witchcraft, her charm recast as manipulation, and Bullen's story with Henry reminds us that desire in history is rarely tidy. It is bound up in the messy realities of the human body, in sweat, in sickness, in fragrance both sweet and sour. And so we are left with a question: did Henry ever truly love Anne, or did he love the freshness she brought to a court that smelled of decay? And if her scent had lingered longer, would his passion have endured, or was it always destined to sour beneath the weight of sweat and scandal? Henry VIII's later years were a contradiction of grandeur and decay. The king who had once dazzled with athleticism, charm, and seduction now became a figure weighed down by illness, pain, and the very smells of his own body. His court still shimmered with jewels, banquets, and music, but behind the velvet curtains, Henry was rotting from within. To understand how his reputation as one of the dirtiest lovers in royal history was sealed, we must walk through these last years, where desire persisted, but always in the shadow of stench, disease, and decline. By the 1540s, Henry was obese, likely weighing more than 300 pounds. His once powerful legs were ulcerated and bandaged daily, leaking pus and blood that no amount of perfume could disguise. Attendants reported the smell was so strong that courtiers sometimes avoided standing too close. He was lifted onto his horse with machinery, struggled to walk, and often had to be carried in a special chair. Yet his appetites, for food, for power, and for affection, did not fade. His body betrayed him, but his will remained fierce. Even as his health failed, Henry continued to marry. After Anne Boleyn's execution, he wed Jane Seymour, who died giving birth to his long-awaited son, Edward. Anne of Cleves came next, but Henry rejected her quickly, complaining that she did not please his senses, a judgment that spoke as much of his own declining body as hers. Catherine Howard, young and vibrant, briefly reignited his passion. But the contrast between her freshness and his odor made their union both intoxicating and grotesque. When she was executed for adultery, the whispers of her betrayal suggested not only political disloyalty but perhaps also the difficulty of desiring a man whose body was falling apart. His final wife, Catherine Parr, became more nurse than lover. She attended to his ulcers, managed his temper, and endured the heavy, stagnant air of his chambers. For her, love was duty, wrapped in the smell of ointments, herbs, and sickness. Life at Henry's court remained excessive until the end. Banquets continued, though the king could no longer enjoy them as he once had. Perfumed gloves and rosewater cloths were used to mask his wounds. Yet no amount of lavender or musk could fully cover the reality. The courtiers adapted, as people always do, to the environment around them. They learned to endure the smell of their king as part of their loyalty. But in the whispers of servants and foreign ambassadors, the truth spread. Henry VIII was not only feared but pitied, a man of immense power trapped in a failing, fetid body. Henry died in January 1547. Accounts tell us that his body, placed in a lead-lined coffin, began to leak before burial, filling the air with a foul stench. For some observers, this final detail seemed like poetic justice. A man who had lived surrounded by sweat, blood, and excess was betrayed even in death by the odor of decay. His 6 marriages, his bloody politics, and his personal appetites left an indelible mark on England. But behind the great acts of history, the Reformation, the dissolution of monasteries, the birth of modern monarchy, lies the intimate reality of a man whose lovers endured the smells of desire, disease, and decline. Henry VIII's story forces us to consider how much of history is shaped not only by words and deeds but also by bodies, sweating, bleeding, decaying bodies. His charisma was real, but so was the odor that clung to him. His passions changed the course of nations, yet they unfolded in chambers thick with the smells of roasted meat, musk, and infected wounds. And so we are left with one last thought: if Henry had lived in an age of modern medicine, soap and deodorant, would his lovers have loved him longer? Or was his stench, like his ambition, always destined to overwhelm those closest to him? When you think of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, you may imagine the glittering court of Versailles, chandeliers, mirrors, fountains, and endless gardens. Yet beneath this spectacle lay a truth often ignored: Versailles was not only a palace of splendor but also a palace of smells. Louis XIV's reign, 1643–1715, defined French grandeur, but it also defined the sensory politics of love and power. In this palace where thousands lived side by side, desire was constantly entangled with the challenge of odor, the perfumes that masked it, the filth that lingered, and the very air that bound courtiers to their king. Versailles was built to dazzle, but it was not built with modern plumbing. The palace housed thousands of nobles, servants, and soldiers, yet lacked enough latrines to serve them. Visitors complained that courtiers relieved themselves in hallways, gardens, and stairwells. The grand fountain sparkled in the sun, but just beyond the glitter, the air could reek of waste. To counter this, Versailles became the capital of perfume. Rooms were washed with vinegar, gloves were scented with ambergris, and courtiers carried pomanders of clove and musk. The palace itself was like a giant perfume bottle, designed to mask what lay beneath. For Louis, this atmosphere was intentional. By trapping nobles in a palace where they lived under his watch, even amid discomfort and stench, he ensured their loyalty. Versailles was both paradise and prison, its perfume a tool of political control. Louis XIV was famously meticulous about his appearance. He bathed in perfumed water, wore gloves steeped in scent, and surrounded himself with fragrant oils. His mornings began with the lever, a public ritual where courtiers watched him dress. Every gesture was political, every scent a sign of refinement. Yet his body, like all bodies, betrayed him. In later years, Louis suffered from fistulas, ulcers, and infections. Court doctors used ointments and poultices that had their own pungent odors. The Sun King's body was both adored and pitied, perfumed and diseased. And yet, lovers continued to orbit him. His mistresses, Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan, and Madame de Maintenon, endured not only the politics of passion but also the physical realities of life in a palace where glamour and filth coexisted. Louis turned his gardens into theaters of seduction. Lovers strolled beneath trimmed hedges, exchanged glances by fountains, and whispered in perfumed bowers. The air was heavy with the smell of orange blossoms, roses, and jasmine cultivated by royal gardeners. But even here, the illusion cracked. Beneath the perfume of flowers lay the earthy smell of manure used to keep the gardens alive. Courtiers could not escape the constant reminder that beauty and rot existed side by side. Desire, like the gardens themselves, was carefully managed but never entirely free from decay. Louis XIV's love life was as grand as his reign, but it was also profoundly shaped by scent and survival. Perfume was not merely an accessory, it was a necessity. a veil over the physical realities of a crowded palace. So we must ask, when Louis's lovers leaned close, what did they truly breathe in? Was it the fragrance of roses and musk, or the unavoidable odor of sweat and waste that seeped through Versailles' golden halls? If Louis XIV's palace was a gilded cage of odors, then his mistresses were its brightest birds. They fluttered in and out of favor, each carrying her own allure, her own perfume, her own power. To understand how love functioned at Versailles, we must see how these women navigated not only the king's desire but also the overwhelming sensory world of the court. Louis's first great love was Louise de la Vallière, a gentle, timid woman who seemed almost lost in the glitter of Versailles. She was modest in her habits, sometimes overwhelmed by the noise, the gossip, and the smells of the crowded palace. Accounts suggest she preferred lighter perfumes, lavender and orange blossom, as if to protect herself with a veil of simplicity. Yet the reality around her was harsher. Versailles' corridors often stank of spilled food, sweat, and human waste. To love the king meant enduring not only his embrace but also the sensory assault of life in his court. Louise, unable to bear the constant attention and scandal, eventually withdrew to a convent. Perhaps the silence, and the cleaner air, of the cloister was a relief after years of suffocating perfume and political intrigue. Where Louise was modest, Madame de Montespan was overwhelming. She drenched herself in heavy perfumes, musk, ambergris, and jasmine, that announced her presence before she even entered a room. For Louis, who adored spectacle, she was intoxicating. But her perfumes carried another layer of meaning. In an age when scent was tied to morality, some whispered that her overpowering musk concealed darker practices. Montespan was later implicated in the affair of the poisons, accused of using love potions and black masses to secure the king's affection. Though evidence was uncertain, the association between her scent and sorcery lingered. Her fragrance was not just luxury, it was a weapon, a way to dominate the senses of everyone around her. Yet it also fueled suspicion, making her a symbol of both passion and danger. After the storm came calm. Louis's final love, Madame de Maintenon, preferred discretion. She avoided heavy perfumes, favoring softer, almost imperceptible fragrances. For her, scent was not seduction but reassurance, a sign of refinement without excess. As Louis aged and his body betrayed him with disease, ulcers, and weakness, Maintenon's restraint offered comfort. She did not overwhelm the senses but soothed them, creating an atmosphere of quiet stability in contrast to the chaos of earlier years. In her presence, the court smelled less of musk and scandal, more of medicinal herbs, ointments, and the muted perfumes of religious devotion. She turned the Sun King's final years into something more bearable, less a festival of desire, more a twilight of control. For these women, fragrance was more than personal taste. It was a declaration of identity, a claim to space in a palace where every breath was shared with thousands. Louise's lavender whispered innocence. Montespan's musk roared with ambition. Maintenon's subtle oils breathed endurance. Each scent told a story, and together they reveal how Versailles itself was a battlefield of perfumes, where to smell a certain way was to wield power, to seduce, to survive. And yet, as Louis's mistresses came and went, Versailles remained the same, dazzling, suffocating, perfumed, and foul all at once. The Sun King demanded brilliance, but beneath it all, the odors of humanity persisted. So we are left with a question: did perfume truly sweeten love at Versailles, or did it only disguise the staleness beneath? Were these romances born of genuine affection, or of carefully managed illusions carried on scented air? When the Sun King rose in glory, the palace of Versailles glittered with light, sound, and scent. But like all suns, Louis XIV eventually began to sink. The decline of his body, the weariness of his court, and the shifting tides of history left Versailles not only dazzling but also heavy with the odor of mortality. By the early 1700s, Louis's health was failing. His legs were swollen with gout, his teeth had mostly rotted away, and his skin bore the marks of years of disease and treatments. In 1715, a gangrene infection spread through his leg, and the smell was so foul that courtiers struggled to remain near him. Ironically, this was a palace drenched in perfume, and yet no amount of jasmine or musk could mask the stench of the dying king. His chamber, once a place where courtiers had jostled for the privilege of watching him rise each morning, now became a suffocating theater of sickness. Doctors tried to use scented compresses and incense to purify the air, but the reality of his decay could not be hidden. For a man who had spent his life dazzling the senses, his final months were a reminder that even kings are subject to the same bodily truths as peasants. The palace itself reflected this contradiction. To visitors, Versailles seemed like a dream, mirrors catching candlelight, fountains spraying, dancers twirling in the halls. But behind the spectacle lay the undeniable realities. Thousands of people lived in its rooms, and plumbing was scarce. Human waste sometimes piled in corners. Perfumes were splashed liberally to disguise sweat, sickness, and refuse. In summer, the air could be unbearable, hot, stagnant, filled with the mingling smells of roses, musk, food, and filth. For courtiers, living in Versailles was like existing inside a giant scented box, gilded, perfumed, but always on the verge of suffocation. When Louis finally died in September 1715, the courtiers who had lived under his rule for decades found themselves disoriented. The man who had demanded to be the center of every moment, the sun around which all planets revolved, was gone. But his scent lingered. Literally. His chambers, heavy with incense and perfumes, held on to the memory of his presence. And metaphorically, too, the culture of fragrance he had cultivated continued into the 18th century. Perfume had become not just a luxury but a language, a way for nobles to express power, wealth, and seduction. The court of Louis XIV left France addicted to scent, an addiction that would only deepen in the decades before the Revolution. Looking back, one sees that love at Versailles was not tender in the modern sense. It was theatrical, strategic, performed in public and drenched in perfume. The king's lovers used scent as armor and as weapons, and Louis himself used fragrance to shape his image as the dazzling, untouchable Sun King. Yet beneath the layers of musk and roses, Versailles smelled of something else, of bodies. Pressed too close together, of ambition, of sickness, of decay. The perfume could only ever disguise, never transform. That if perfume could carry such weight in the 17th century, shaping politics, love, and identity, what does that tell us about the illusions we craft today? Do our own methods of disguising flaws, whether in appearance or in technology, differ so much from the heavy musk of Versailles? And perhaps the more haunting question, when history remembers Louis XIV and his lovers, does it recall the intoxicating perfume of their passion, or the foul stench that even the greatest perfumes could never truly erase?